bless for that. And indeed, she just raised the bars. But that is exactly what it is. It's been 30 years since we adopted our constitution. We went to a referendum and we decided that we would take on this constitution, this document that has governed us now for 30 years. Today is exactly 30 years since that referendum. And in fact, I want to quickly read to you on that day back in Accra on that 28th day of April, a Washington Post article, news story about that day. In fact, it read, voters in this West African nation went to the polls today in a referendum on a new constitution that will pave the way for multi-party democracy after a decade of military rule. The question to the people was simply adopt or not. Do we want a multi-party democracy or not? And it was yes or no, and we were emphatically yes. That paved the way for multi-party democracy. The ban on political parties was lifted exactly on the 18th of May, 1992. That paved the way later that year in November for the presidential elections, first in 10 years, and later in December for the parliamentary elections, first in 10 years. Remember, the Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings had then been in power on the ticket of the PNDC, of course, a military junta for since the 31st of December 1981. So today we're marking that, and the president has decided to address the nation just to lay out his own thoughts on this living document called the Constitution, which we have used for 30 years. What will he say? We're anticipating that he will say a few things about the document, but he will also lay for us his own thoughts about the amendments that are required, the reviews that he believes needs to happen to make this constitutional document a living one, a better one than we first introduced in 1992. A few things that we expect for him to touch on. He will definitely, we understand, touch on the MMDCE elections. You remember, it was under his watch that we nearly amended the Constitution, that entrenched clause there to make the MMDC positions an elected one, that you get to vote. We understand he will talk about that. What he says about that, we will tell you pretty shortly. We expect that he will say something very fundamentally substantive about it. Is it going to be back on the table between now and the time that he leaves office? Remember, this is his legacy term, and that will be one big legacy indeed if he gets to cross that hurdle. It's about the Constitution. He will also talk about this document, what amendments are required. And so this is a major speech indeed. And let's put this in context, shall we? Because in the last few weeks, the document, the Constitution, has been a subject of some great controversy. Many parts of it has been subject to interpretation, had gone to the Supreme Court for interpretation because parts of it pose a challenge. Also because for the very first time since this Constitution was adopted, since that referendum, 30 years ago today, we had now for the very first time a hung parliament, which introduces its own set of unique challenges that the Constitution faced. And it is very, very, I guess, unique and very, the timing is perfect, coming in the context of all that, for the president to address us on his thoughts on this document. Remember that some of the key things that we have contended about and has been very controversial when it comes to this constitution in the last few weeks has been, for example, can a Speaker of Parliament, whilst presiding, a Deputy Speaker, whilst presiding, can he cast his vote in Parliament? We didn't think that was an issue. The Constitution was fine. Nobody had talked about that until this same Constitution produced a hung Parliament. And so it went to the Supreme Court. The interpretation was sound, and yet it delivered some major controversy. That is one key one. And then that has gone back to the Supreme Court for further interpretation. Again, what is the quorum you require if you want to take decisions on the floor? That has never been an issue because we've never had a hung parliament before. It is an issue now. So it's a subject of a constitutional contestation. What is at least half of parliament? This is very interesting. Let's go back. When this constitution was first adopted, we didn't have 575 members of parliament. In fact, at that time, there were only 16 million Ghanaians in 1992. Do you know how many we are currently, according to the latest housing census and population census? We are just over 30 million people. That is, in 30 years, since the Constitution was promulgated and passed and we went to the referendum, we have doubled the population. So that tells you, it's a time to take a second look at this Constitution on this day as we mark it. The President will give us an indication of that as we wait to hear him. In the next few minutes, he's going to be taken to the screens across the country, and he will be live here on the Joy News channel, and we'll bring that live to you, what he intends to say. We understand he's going to be speaking for just about 15 minutes, where he will lay his thoughts, look back on this constitutional journey we've been on in the last 30 years, after which we will analyze what he says. We put together a crack panel for you. My colleague Raymond Akwa will be joining me very shortly as we build them into this. Plus, when we're done, we will speak to a few legal brains in people who have just expressed an interest in the Constitution as a living document, to give you a post-address analysis. We'll be joined by Kofi Bento. He is a lawyer. He's also a vice president of Imani Africa. We'll be joined by a former presidential candidate of the CPP, himself now a stalwart of a group that calls themselves the National Interest Movement, named for short, Dr. Abusakara Foster. That group had been formed with one sole objective: to push and campaign for a review of the same document we adopted in 1992. We'll also speak to Benjamin Bodo. He's a member of parliament. He is the ranking on the local government committee in the House. He's been to court on this constitution as far as the local government system is concerned. We expect the president to say something about the MMDCE election or not. He will give us his thoughts on that when we are done. And so we have this covered for you. And of course, Raymond will take over at 6 p.m. with Upfront, with more guests joining in with their thoughts on what the president is just about to say. So you want to stay with us for all this all-round coverage of the president's speech on a very important day indeed. The Constitution, the document that has been that supreme law that has governed our lives for 30 years, is today indeed a full-grown adult, crossed 30, exactly on this day. And the president is about to speak to us on his own thoughts. As a lawyer himself, he's seen and lived this document. He has challenged many parts of it. He has stood on the shoulders of the Constitution as a lawyer in court and argued, won some, lost some. It's interesting to hear what he has to say about this in the next 1 minute or so. We'll cross over pretty shortly to hear the president when he is about to speak. We can go to the president now, can we? When he starts speaking. So you want to stay with us, because just in the next few minutes, the president will begin to address us. And I was referencing, we've just been in a mood of nostalgia a bit, trying to go back to that day. I was a child then, in the 1992, on this day, on the 28th of April, when we went to the polls. Now, I want to cross over now to the Jubilee House, where the president is just about to address the nation.
Fellow Ghanaians, 30 years ago today, on 28th April 1992, we Ghanaians took one of the most important decisions of our history. We went to the polls to decide in a referendum the nature of the future governance of our nation. whether to continue to live under military rule or to live under democratic rule. Indeed, the days, months, years, and decades prior to that day had seen the nation sample almost every form of governance known to man. We began our life at independence with multi-party democracy, which transitioned in the First Republic into one-party rule. 3 out of the 5 coups d'etats in our history resulted in the overthrow of 3 civilian governments. 2 of the coups removed military governments, and there was strong resistance to the idea of the formation of a so-called union government in Ghana. Predictably, we experienced from these events a weakening of the sense of self-confidence and progress of the Ghanaian, which was evidenced by the fact that components of the Human Development Index, i.e. life expectancy rates, access to education, and per capita income indicators at the time were not commensurate with our vast potential. Several attempts to take Ghana down the path of multi-party democracy were met in some quarters with stiff opposition and cynical responses. Those who would rather have authoritarian rule foisted on the citizenry claimed Ghana was underdeveloped and we needed to get things done in a hurry. They claimed that democracy was cumbersome and would divide Ghanaians along tribal lines. However, the will was widespread and virtually unanimous to have the decade-long ban on party political activities, imposed in 1981, lifted, and a return to multi-party democracy established. The Ghanaian people wanted to live in conditions of freedom, where there was respect for individual liberties, human rights, and the principles of democratic accountability. The Provisional National Defense Council, PNDC, in power since the 31st December 1981 coup, set up the National Consultative Assembly in May 1991 and tasked the body to prepare a draft constitution for the country. 3 months down the line, a draft constitution was produced, and on 28 April 1992, Ghanaians went to the polls in the referendum to make a decision for which we, the current and future generations, are the beneficiaries. 3,408,119 Ghanaians voted yes in the referendum, representing 92.59% of the vote, to return our nation to democratic rule, as opposed to 272,855 voting no, representing a mere 7.41%. The Constitution, overwhelmingly approved in the referendum, set up a liberal democratic state founded on the separation of powers, with exclusive power in the judiciary to superintend and enforce the Constitution and protect the fundamental human rights of the citizenry. The coming into effect of the 1992 Constitution was promulgated with immense popular backing, and on 7th January 1993, His Excellency Jerry John Rawlings, chairman of the erstwhile PNDC, was sworn into office as the first president of the Fourth Republic. We have since then experienced the longest uninterrupted period of stable constitutional governance in our history, banishing the specter of instability that had disfigured much of our nation's early existence, and the benefits are showing. We have, over the last 30 years, witnessed sustained growth in every facet of national life. There have been considerable improvements in the Human Development Index. Simply put, democracy has been good for us. Today, democracy, equality of opportunity, and respect for human rights and the rule of law, ideals which have stood the test of time in most of the world, have now found firm anchor in our body politic. We've had 5 presidents in the history of the Fourth Republic, with peaceful transfers of power from a governing to an opposition party on 3 separate occasions. Even when there was disagreement with the outcome of an election, it was the Supreme Court on 2 occasions, rather than the streets, that validated its result. We are arguably the most stable democracy in West Africa. On this day, the 30th anniversary of the referendum, whose votes ushered in the Fourth Republic, I urge all of us to renew trust in our democracy and bear in mind at all times the oft-cited statement that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I say so because there are some who, for their own parochial and selfish interests, would want to see a return to the dark days of authoritarian rule, simply because, with no respect for the Ghanaian people, they are either unwilling to subject themselves or their vision to the open scrutiny of the Ghanaian people, or because they know they will be rejected by the Ghanaian people and thus seek a shortcut to office and power. Let us strengthen our resolve to resist such persons for our common good. Despite all the gains we have made in the Fourth Republic, we must acknowledge that we have not reached the potential we should have. The biggest challenge we face continues to be eradicating poverty. We still have challenges in the performance of our public services. We face threats, traditional and contemporary, to our nation's security and social stability in the form of chieftaincy conflicts, land disputes, ethnic conflicts, cybersecurity issues, youth unemployment, economic hardships, and corruption in our public life. In recent times, we've been witnessing significant difficulties in the management of the national economy, largely as a result of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the global economy, which has been exacerbated by the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the basic commitment to resolving these challenges within the framework of due process and democratic institutions must remain unshaken. And I'm confident that, God willing, we will overcome these challenges. Fellow Ghanaians, one primary goal of the Constitution was to decentralize the structure of governance in Ghana so that government would be brought closer to the people. One fundamental barrier to the realization of this goal has to do with the ramifications of Article 55, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which currently bars political parties from involvement in district assembly elections and local government. The attempt I made in 2019 to repeal this provision and allow for the participation of political parties in local government was aborted because of the lack of a broad national consensus when the opposition NDC signaled its inability to back the repeal. It was and continues to be my view that the repeal or modification of an entrenched clause of the Constitution should attract widespread support to make it acceptable and healthy for the body politic. We should further bear in mind the strong attachment of the Ghanaian people to multi-party democratic elections. On the average, the turnout for national elections in the Fourth Republic has been 72%, one of the highest in the world, whilst the turnout for the allegedly non-partisan local government elections has always hovered around 30%. I've said it before, and I'll repeat it. I will continue to work for an extensive national consensus on this issue. And should such a consensus be attained for the repeal of Article 55, Clause 3 of the Constitution, and an agreement reached for political parties to participate in and sponsor candidates for election to district assemblies, at any point during my remaining tenure of office as President of the Republic, the matter will be brought back again to the front burner of our public discourse for the necessary action. I'm hoping that after completing the necessary consultations, I will shortly be in a position to announce a way forward on this important matter. Fellow Ghanaians, 30 years since the referendum of 28 April 1992 has taught us that there are no shortcuts for the progress and prosperity of our country. Only hard work, creativity, innovation, a sense of enterprise, and unity in the nation can produce the accelerated economic development that we all yearn for and deserve. On this anniversary occasion, I'm proud to say that I believe strongly in the values and principles of the Constitution that emerged from the referendum, and in the indigenous democratic heritage of Ghana. And I'm calling on all Ghanaians also to assert vigorously this same belief. We should never forget, though, that the Constitution is a living document. And so whenever circumstances required, we should be prepared to make the necessary amendments to it to reflect the needs of contemporary and future times. May God continue to bless the Constitution of the Fourth Republic and us all. And may God bless our homeland Ghana and make her great and strong. I thank you for your attention.
So that's the President of the Republic, President Akufo-Addo, addressing the nation on this occasion. Today is exactly 30 years since the Constitution, the 1992 Constitution, was adopted by all of us. There were 16 million Ghanaians then, the majority voted. Those who were qualified to vote indeed voted to adopt it. They said yes to it, and that's where we are today. The President has laid out his thoughts. He looked back on the last 30 years, and he gave us a sense of where we are today and where he believes we should go. A few things that he said that we need to touch on. First, of course, he looked back to the times in the early 80s and early 90s, where there was a huge debate around what to do, moving from the military regime as presided over by Flight Lieutenant General Rawlings and the PNDC, and the contestation surrounding what we should do with the Constitution. Of course, Ghanaians voted yes for it, but he touches on a few things. He believes democracy and this constitutional democracy has been good for us. Do you agree with him? We'll get your thoughts on this very shortly, and the thoughts of other eminent Ghanaians who are joining us on this particular matter. And then he goes ahead to talk about, and I guess this is within the context of what has happened recently. He says, although democracy has been good for us, he says there are a few who, for parochial and selfish interest, want to return this whole country to the dark ages, because he alleges they have no respect for the Ghanaian people and want a shortcut to power. He urges all Ghanaians to resist this group of people. Of course, he names nobody. He didn't cite any particular individual in the context of what he said there. But we all know what has happened recently. The word coup d'etat has become a word that in the last few weeks and months this year has become very, very controversial and has returned into our national conversations. In addiction has become very prominent. In fact, there currently is a case in court. Somebody's currently being tried because of the use of that very word. So it's a very controversial subject. Indeed, the President addressed that. you know, that people would like to overthrow the constitution. He urges all Ghanaians to resist them. That's his view there on the matter. He says that he admits, however, that in spite of how good the constitution has been, we have failed to reach our full potential as a people in eradicating poverty, dealing with insecurity, dealing with youth unemployment and corruption, etc. And he then admits to the current economic challenges, what he calls recent significant difficulties in our economy. That's how he puts it. Recent significant difficulties in our economy. And then he talks about that is largely down to COVID and to the war on Ukraine. But he says, in spite of the current economic difficulties, you should not lose faith in the 1992 Constitution. And that he was very emphatic. He, of course, currently as our leader, collectively, we will overcome, he says. So don't lose faith, he says, in the Constitution. Don't attempt to overthrow it, I guess is what he was suggesting there. And then he goes on to talk about one of the most controversial attempts yet at amending a part of the Constitution so entrenched, so polarizing indeed. He made that attempt. That is the attempt to get MMDCEs elected by all of us. He says, he explains why he pulled the plugs on that. We're very close to the referendum when the plugs were pulled. He says he did that because he believed that for that entrenched provision to be amended, he believed it should come in the midst of a broad national consensus. And because there wasn't that consensus, he didn't believe it should go ahead. And he cites the problem. That the problem was the NDC withdrawing its decision, its backing for that amendment. And that's why the plugs were pulled. But then he gave a promise. But that's a conditional promise. He says, sometime during his term, before his term is over, on the 7th of January, 2025, he will definitely bring back this subject for all of us to consider. But it will be dependent on whether they are able, in these consultations that he says will begin, to get broad political consensus. So I guess he's saying, I need to get the NDC's backing into this. If I don't get the NDC's backing, we possibly will not have the referendum to decide whether or not we should elect our MMDCEs. But I remember the controversial side that he did not touch on it particularly, but the NDC's disagreement is that, do you do this on partisan lines or you don't? I don't know how they're going to achieve that, but he says they will try. So that's a very important announcement indeed tonight. And then he ends by talking about, he returns to the subject of believing in the Constitution. Don't overthrow it in spite of the challenges that we are facing. He says there are people who want a shortcut to power, and that the process to constitutional maturity takes time. It won't come now. We have to work at it. Raymond Akwa is with me in the studio. We'll be joined shortly by a few of our guests who will be joining us for some on right now. Dr. Abu Sakara Foster, who leads this national interest movement. They've been formed to champion fundamentally constitutional review, is joining us right now. We have also joining us is Kofi Bentil. You see him there on the screens. Also joining us is the Vice President of Imani Africa. We'll also be joined by Benjamin Bodo, who is the Vice Chair on Parliament Local Government Committee. Remember that the President's main line there was about what to do with MMDC elections. All of them joining me shortly. By the way, we are live on Joy 99.7 FM tonight as we digest what the President has told us on the day when we mark 30 years of our Constitution. Raymond, very quick thoughts on what the President said.
Interesting thoughts, especially when he takes us through the history of it and brings it back to the current situation. The admissions he makes of the economy is being progressive. Now he taxes at the significant difficulties in the economy, which is also very interesting. The point he made about 55-3 is very interesting.
Tell me.
Because 55-3 says that subject to the other provisions of the Constitution, a political party is free to participate in shaping the political will of the people, to disseminate information on political ideas, social and economic programs of a national character, and sponsor candidates for election to any public office other than to district assemblies or local level government units. That was not the only controversial part. This is controversial because when you remove this, they can contest. every election at every level. So the current district assembly election, not district assembly, I'm talking about the current unit committee elections, the current assemblies elections, the election of assembly members, they can actually contest that. What also was interesting was that this is what the people largely rejected. The other difficulty I didn't hear much from him on was to do with the other article, which actually says that this is where we want to go as a people when it comes to the election. That is to do with the provision that says that they should be elected. So back to the controversy. The president is still saying, unless they are elected on partisan lines, I'm less likely to consider this to be brought back to the front burner as a matter that should have the general consensus. Because clearly the NDC agreed to the election of MMDCs. What they didn't agree to was the election on partisan lines, removing that 53 caveat to let that happen. I don't know whether that's going to change the people's mind. There's also the point that you hear a candid review of what has happened by your president. He admits to difficulties in the system. He admits to what's likely going to go forward. I think he's shifting stance more on the issue about constitutional amendments. So first, the president seemed to have been saying, we are fine, our constitution is good to go. No need for any review of a sort. But I got the indication at the very last end of his statement that if there is a living document, that they need to make the amendments that are required to, when we need it, we should be able to do that. That is, to many people, will be a shift, a major review from, oh, let's take our time in seeking some of these things to, oh, we can do it. If only we need it. Hopefully, the people have also been at the extreme end demanding that we should throw away the entire constitution, we'll come to the table or come to the middle. Then there'll be a meeting of minds at the middle to get to this point. So, but I mean, anniversary, yes, but some of the things he said were quite reflective and phenomenal, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, that last point you make is so important, that if you follow the president, his thoughts on the constitutional review has always been the constitution is fine.
Yeah.
We don't need to review it. You know, if there are aspects. But today he made a very important point there, and I want to quote him: the Constitution is a living document, and we should be prepared to make the necessary amendments to it if the need arises. Mr. Bento, what are your thoughts on what the president just said a short while ago?
Thank you, Evans. I share some of the thoughts that you have just expressed, but I also have my regrets, and I am hoping that he would live up to the promise he just made, that before his term ends, we would take another look at the election of DCs and MCs. I don't share some of the fears and some of the positions he took, however, but I think generally it was a good speech. It reminds us that we should not take this constitutional era for granted. It is important for us to also appreciate that this is the longest period we have had under constitutional rule. And every analysis will show you that our development moves consistently and furthest when we are under constitutional rule. And I share the president's sentiments about those who call for coup d'etats and an overthrow of this constitution. I have told many people many times that anybody who calls for coup d'etats is either too young to remember how things were under, dictators, or does not understand exactly what it means to lose democracy and to lose freedom. No matter how hard it is under a democracy, it has been found to be the best system of government that human beings have invented. However, what we must not do is to assume that having a constitution means democracy. I mean, those of us who study constitutional law, there's one major issue in constitutional law called a constitution without constitutionalism. So we can have a constitution and not have constitutionalism. These are the things we must guard against. For instance, a situation where the arms of government are hijacked, a situation where you engineer an arrangement where the whole aim of even constitutionalism is defeated. For instance, the separation of powers. I still insist that we must stop hiring ministers from parliament, because you have a separation of powers and then you engineer a system to defeat it by bringing people from the legislature into the executive. And therefore, you have a parliament which basically cannot stand on its own and hold the executive in check. These are the things we need to deal with and we need to review to make our constitution better. Let's make this point also. I remember actually in a discussion with the president not too long ago, I made a point that much as the president was making the point that this is the longest standing constitution we've had and we must be careful in trying to amend it. And the point that I made, which I want to repeat, is this. This constitution was designed to deliver to Ghana political stability. I remember because in 1991, we were part of the argument that let's accept it even with all these transitional provisions and whatever. Because much as it had some faults, the intention was that this country has not been successful in managing constitutional rule. So we should build a constitution that would deliver political stability and a multi-party democracy in a constitutional rule. And that is what it was designed to do. And that has been achieved. We have had 30 years of that. Now, in doing that, we had to sacrifice certain things. For instance, the overwhelming power of the presidency. This is one of the things we had to sacrifice. And we had to sacrifice certain things. For instance, Article 71 that we are all complaining about, to strengthen certain notes and make sure that, we will not lose this constitution. But what we sacrificed was a developmental constitution, which is to say a constitution that will surely deliver to us some sort of arrangement that will speed up our development. Now, let's be clear. You cannot have development without political stability. So political stability is step one. But when you have achieved step one, you need to move on to development without losing step one. So it is time for us to now engineer this constitution to become a developmental constitution without losing the stability that we have gained so far. And I think that one of the things that the president can do, which will be unpardonable if he does not do it in his term of office, is to make sure we elect district chief executives and municipal chief executives. And I disagree with the president when he says that we need to amend the entrenched clauses before we can do that. We do not need to amend the entrenched clauses to elect our DCEs and MCs. We can elect them tomorrow by an act of parliament. But political party participation in that process is what requires amendment. We don't need political party participation to elect DCEs and MCs. So indeed, I think the president can deliver on that issue without forcing us to go through a referendum to do an amendment. And indeed, if he doesn't achieve this, it will be unpardonable.
Yeah.
At best, we will say that he failed, but at worst, and that is what some people said at the first time when he failed, and we will say that the president does not even intend for us to do that because, in fact, politicians in office like it that they appoint DCs and MCs. So we'll hold the president to it and hope that he can bring this to pass at least before he goes.
Mr. Bento, stay with me. That's a very interesting thought. I will explore that a bit more because he lays out a condition for bringing back this to the front burner. We'll examine that condition. Let me bring in Dr. Abu Sakara Foster, who has been campaigning very vigorously since last year and way before that for this constitution to be amended, many parts of it. Mr. Abu Sakara Foster, you had a president today, marking 30 years. You've had his speech. What are your initial thoughts on it?
Well, good evening, first of all, to all the viewers. I think two things. First of all, let us all be agreed that no one is calling for an abortion of the Constitution. We want a reinforcement of the Constitution by amending it to be more responsive to our democracy and its needs today. And I think to juxtapose continuity of the Constitution against this abortion, I think it's not the mainstream of what we are talking about today. That is a fringe element, as my good friend Kofi Benchel has said, who are either immature enough or inexperienced enough to know what it means to exist devoid of a constitutional framework. So we are all agreed with the president that the establishment of the rule of law on this day, celebrating 30 years of it, is a worthwhile thing to do. Nonetheless, we are not where we are supposed to be as a nation. And the reasons for that are entrenched in some of the imbalances in power within the Constitution, some of the inadequacies in terms of independence of constitutional bodies, and also some of the entrenched ability to govern by manifesto without committing to a long-term national development plan that will ensure continuity and focus and consistency. All these things, we've spoken about them time and again. So to juxtapose the need for those things against people who are calling for abortion of the Constitution, I think is not helpful. I think it is more helpful to focus the debate on where are the areas where we can make bigger improvements that will bring about the transformation that we have sought in this Fourth Republic, but have not yet attained. We are still a raw material producing country by and large. We are still a low income, well, if you like, for the sake of argument, a middle low income country. And we want to transform our economy to a value added economy. And some of the constitutional issues we're talking about relate not only to governance, but also to the economy and the kind of society we want to build. This is what is being spoken to in terms of a development constitution. And I think we should not allow anyone to divert our attention from those things by focusing on the fringe elements that are calling for all kinds of things which are really unrealistic. So please, on this day, let us not focus on that fringe element. Let us focus on the broad majority of people who agree with the president that we have had 30 years of stability. We're to be congratulated on that. But there's a big deficit in what we have achieved in terms of where we should be as a nation. And we need to now move from first gear to second gear to be able to get to third gear. No vehicle travels in first gear all the time.
Let's settle on some of the specifics. Let's zero in on the last point Kofi Bento touched on. The president's promise that at some point in this term, in this legacy term, he's going to bring back the election of MNDC to the front burner, except the condition is that he needs broad national partisan support to this particular move. And he is clear what he wants to do. Article 55.3, and Raymond was articulate in stating what that is. This is the element that was the one that, got the NDC to back off, which is that, yes, elect. Are you electing it on partisan basis or not partisan basis? The president wants to says he wants to build a consensus. If I get consensus on that, I will get it through. If I don't, it's not happening. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the first thing is this. If we are advocating for broader inclusion and participation in our democracy to enhance our democracy, to be for the many and not the few, then we have to accept that what the majority of people want is what goes. Now, there was broad consultation on this matter, and it was agreed that we would vote on non-partisan basis. To seek to then turn that into a partisan voting against the wishes of the majority, I think I strongly disagree with the president on that point of view. Secondly, it's not seeking consensus to ask people to agree with you. Otherwise, they wouldn't get what they want. That is not consensus. That is dragging them along with you. And what we want to see is a genuine consensus. If the consensus arrives that, yes, we should repeal it, and everybody agrees, as much as I am against it, I will support it. However, if the majority of people, which they are saying so, is that we should vote on non-partisan basis, then we must reach consensus and abandon the position of voting on partisan basis so that we vote on non-partisan basis. And I wholly agree with Kofi Benson, not just because the current president is going out, but because he represents the handover of the baton from one generation to a younger generation. And they have a responsibility to hand over a constitution that represents all of us. And on this day, I would strongly urge the president to review his position on this matter and not stand to the position of voting on partisan basis, but leave it open. And if his broad consensus shows that people want it on non-partisan basis, Whether or not he agrees with it, he should proceed with it. That will be the greatest legacy that he will leave the younger generation. But it is not the only thing that needs changing. There are other things related to having a long-term national development plan, entrenching the
Dr. Sakara, I'll come
many
to
other things.
I'll come to the broader themes, because I think the president, before he ended, threw in a lifeline when he said it's a living document, and so when it becomes necessary, amend it. So we'll come to some of the other things that would encompass very shortly. But I want to go back to Mr. Bentel on this subject of the MMDCEs. I mean, Dr. Sakara also makes a point about the president simply forcing people to agree to his position on the partisanship or non-partisanship in the voting for MMDCEs. The president is clear, is he not? I mean, he didn't mix words in what he said. What he wants is 55-3 to be amended, not the one that you suggest could be done through an act of parliament. Does it suggest, though, although he promises he may bring about with the conditions he's introduced, does it suggest, knowing where the NDC stands on the matter, and we'll get their rep in parliament to give us a thought very shortly, that if the president's intention really is to bring this back, this approach means this is dead on arrival?
Exactly. And sometimes you have to understand strategy, okay? Sometimes people erect a condition which is almost impossible, and then they use it as an excuse not to do what they don't want to do anyway. And I agree again with my brother Abu Sakara. Listen, it is the president who is making this his preference. The people of Ghana, by 80%, okay, 80% accent, 80% of people surveyed under by CDD want election of DCs. I have not seen anybody who has given a coherent argument about why we should not elect DCs. So the people of Ghana overwhelmingly agree. There is consensus on the election of DCs. It is the president who is saying that it must be definitely under political party sponsorship. That is not required. It is totally not required. So to the extent that the president makes that a condition without which he will not proceed, gives me a certain view. And like I said, at best, it means the president is incompetent in getting what he wants done. But at worst, he doesn't want it done. And he has simply made this, an impediment so that it never gets done. And I've made the point. Politicians in opposition want elections of DCs. But when they get into power, they want to be the ones to appoint. So I can understand why the president does not want to do that. But I just want to say, if he does not have this thing done, it will forever be in his legacy as one of the things he could have done, but never did. So let me say this. It is overwhelming. The president, if he says that he's looking for consensus, it is consensus from the people of Ghana. It's not the same as consensus from political parties. The people of Ghana are more important than political parties. The people of Ghana can do almost everything without political parties. There are countries where there are no political parties, but they have elections. So we don't need political parties to agree on something before we do it, when the people of Ghana have made it overwhelmingly clear that this is what we want. So indeed, the message should go out to the president that this can be done. Both parties, actually, is one of the few things in this country where it is on record that both parties have given their support to. And nobody is really saying we need to make it partisan before we can do so. And by the way, even if we absolutely have to ultimately make it partisan, we can start with the non-partisan elections whilst we work on the amendment of 55. And I have a suggestion for how we can amend 55. Tomorrow, the president can move in parliament that we should amend that provision and have the elections done. And then in the next election, the next general election, which is a referendum of sorts, without incurring any extra cost, we can add the question of Article 55 to the general election and see whether everybody agrees that we move it or not. And by then, we can have all those things resolved. What I'm saying, Evans, is that tomorrow, we can start moving in parliament to have DCs elected. And in the next general election, we can use the general election as a referendum to have Article 55 amended or otherwise. So there is no reason why we cannot or should not do this. I think the president can do it if he wants to do it.
I mean, so those are where that's where the problem and the challenge is going to be. The president himself anticipates it, and he says he's going to work on building consensus. Let's look at the political dimensions here, Raymond. Samson obviously joins me and with thoughts on this. She's sending me messages on this. I know his thoughts on this are very clear. He references a CDD poll that got over 70% in favor of non-partisan DC elections. Yes. The overwhelming views of the people are known, and the president must respect that, he says. But let's talk about the politics a bit before I bring Dr. Busakara Fox on the other things. The NDC's position on this is very clear. Yeah. Tonight, the president is emphatic on the matter, that his belief is still that this must be done on partisan lines. The
NDC, when they issued their first statement, and let's not forget, the communication in Parliament was that, oh no, they're going hand in hand with government or whatever it was doing first. Then the national chairman of the party then did a press conference. Remember that press conference? He still got, I'm quoting part of it. He says, the referendum, we are told, seeks to amend Article 55(3) of the Constitution. That amendment has nothing to do with the election of metropolitan, municipal, and district chief executives. A notice put out by the EC saying, among others, the referendum is to approve or reject the provision of whether MMDC are to be voted or not. It's a palpable falsehood. It called on Ghanaians, the NDC, officially, to reject any form of engagement on that particular amendment, because it had nothing, that's the 55(3) amendment, had nothing to do with what they had agreed with government, that is the election of MMDCs. And that if government wants to work on anything related to election of MMDCs, it should look to 243. That is where the major difference between the party
that's where Kofi Bento's point is.
Yes.
That you can...
So that's what the NDC said clearly, that we are not with you on this matter, because what you are doing is not seeking to merely give people the opportunity to vote in their DCs or whichever level they find them.
The position on that hasn't changed.
It has not changed at all. In fact, the last time they made an engagement on it, they actually accused government of refusing to comply with the promise in the manifesto to get MMDCs elected. It says that has nothing to do with being elected on partisan basis. So that is where the NDC has been up to this point. I'm unsure whether before the president came in, he had engaged them. And he had actually gotten some consensus, because he seems to make the consensus the most important part of moving forward with this conversation. And it appears
to me, if you read the way he said it, that they are now beginning the process of reaching out and see if they can build consensus.
Interesting. But I think that's still going to be the only thorny part. To the extent that the president stresses on 55(3) and makes no reference to 243, it suggests that that is still to him. It's either they are on partisan basis or not. The NDC's main point is that don't put them on partisan basis. We are fine. And that was the biggest difference between the two parties. Let's not forget, even before the NDC came out, in fact, Samson did a rallying take on this particular one, which got a lot more people joining from civil society, CDD, IDEC, all joining them, bringing evidence. The Afrobarometer was cited heavily to support why people wanted the election done of MMDCs. The only difference, which really has not changed since 2019, is whether or not they should be on partisan basis. I suspect going forward, and mindful of the current climate within Parliament, which is going to be perhaps the biggest stake of the NDC in this particular matter, there will be difficulties in getting the NDC to agree to any form of amendment without it being on non-partisan basis.
Of 55(3). And let's expand this conversation a bit more beyond this, because Dr. Busakara Foster, the president threw you a lifeline today. And, you know, Kofi Bento references their meeting with him very recently, where he was very clear that the Constitution is fine. But today he changed the tone slightly. He says the Constitution is a living organism, a document. We should be prepared to make the necessary amendment to it if indeed the need arises. Are you going to take the president up on this challenge? And which specific areas would you put to him that, as he says, is necessary for amendment?
I think, first of all, we all have to accept that the president is a very astute and mature politician, a very adept at maneuvering his way around the Constitution that we have, because he's been at it for a very long time. So we have to pay very clear attention to what he says, if indeed we want to see some of the things that we want happen. I think the first thing is this: yes, to give room for us to review the Constitution and accept it is a living document, I think is a big step forward. However, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The very small steps, let's get the low-hanging fruits first. And that is back on the issue of the election of the MMDCs on non-partisan basis. If indeed we can have that, then we can look to these other bigger issues, because the other issues that we need to tackle are perhaps even bigger than this one. So
you give us a few. Give us a few of those big ones.
Yes, I think the first thing is that we've had a long debate on entrenchment of a national development plan in the Constitution, so that all governments would follow it for a long enough period, so we don't have. So we have focus on continuity and also on clear targets to be achieved over an extended period, and avoid the issue of abandoned projects and judgment debts that we have seen mar the level of our progress in this 30 years. So this is clear. Now, yes, the reason we need it is because we don't have the discipline to follow through on a long-term development plan, and therefore we need it to be able to guide us along. The actual issue of resorting to manifestos, which are always oscillating from one extreme to the other, is not helping us. And it is clear that that is not helping us, because it doesn't focus on the long-term development issues, but responds only to the short-term development issues. And no country can develop continuously responding to only short-term national development issues. So that is clear. The other thing that we talked about was strengthening the independence of independent constitutional bodies and ensuring that they work impartially and reduce the amount of conflict of interest. And we have seen how this has played out in some of the very big decisions, even going up to the Supreme Court, etc. So we would like to see the manner of appointments of these independent constitutional heads of independent constitutional bodies to be done in a way different to the way in which it's done now, whereas the president will continue to have some influence, but not be the referee and the player at the same time. So that is also important. We also have issues relating to the decentralization. That is not only about election of DCs, but also talking about the scale and whether we have an economy of scale to effect autonomy in decentralization. It's one thing to want government to be closer to the people. It's another thing for the purpose of local government to be autonomous, to be achieved. And at the scale that we have it now, it doesn't have a big enough tax base to be autonomous. So we should clearly think about bringing this level of local government back to regional level. And that would mean that the DCs or whoever is now charged as a head of local government will be elected on regional basis and a non-partisan basis at that. So these are important things that will affect the efficiency, the synergy, the harmony of government that will bring about the accelerated development that the president talked about towards the end of his speech. And we have to ask ourselves that question. If the people we compare ourselves to who've had accelerated development have gone further than us, what are the things that have held us back? The things that have held us back are these things which are in the woodworks of the Constitution, and not the extreme fringe people who are calling for abandonment of the Constitution. They are not the people holding us back, because nobody is going to listen to them. I think the people who are holding us back are those people who do not want to really tackle the development issues inside the Constitution and free up the system to operate at this optimum efficiency so that we can accelerate, both in terms of governance, in terms of the economy, and developing the kind of society that we want to have.
I mean, Mr. Benta, let's look at something that is, I guess, as we mark the 30 years, we shouldn't forget. We marked 30 years of the 1992 Constitution, but this year is also 11 years since we spent millions of cedis to put together a Constitution Review Commission report. And that report was presented to the government of Professor Mills, who set it up. with the view that after so long, of course, by that time we had done more than 20 years of this, that there was a time to take a second look at this living organism. The president referred to that amend when necessary. But since then, we haven't done anything about the Constitutional Review Commission's report. It's been gathering dust on the shelves for 11 years. Is it time now that the president is saying, well, I am amenable to amending the Constitution, to look back at that document and make our money's worth?
Yes, it is time to take constitutional review seriously. But let us not confuse that with the Constitutional Review Commission. I have had opportunities to say elsewhere that the Constitutional Review Commission, much as it came out of a good place, it was an effort that, was based on a popular sentiment. We all wanted something done about the Constitution. The Review Commission is set up, its legal basis and other things were questionable. And what some of us feared was that you can go all the way and then you will hit the snag because it really cannot effect the change we want. Effectively, what the Constitutional Review Commission did was collect views about what should be amended in the Constitution. What we want is for us to move from there to do the actual amendment. So it is time to look at constitutional review, but not necessarily time to go back and do another commission or take the commission and drive it. There are processes and ways by which we can do it. And I think it's time for us to sit down, do it right, and get it over with. And I totally agree that indeed there are a number of things that we need to review in this Constitution, okay? And we should give ourselves a certain timeline to do it. 30 years is a long time, okay? Definitely one of them is the election of district chief executives and municipal chief executives. If we cannot take, accountability of political heads down to the grassroots, we are not doing well in this democracy. There are other things also. For instance, we need to absolutely amend Article 71. We need to make sure that what Article 71 represents, which is really wrong, is removed, because that, I have said, constitutes a threat to this democracy. Article 71, put in another sense, is the elite organizing for themselves a way to escape the common reality of the average Ghanaian. Go and look at what it says in Article 71. And that is why we are discussing wages and salaries, the disparity in wages and salaries today, where you have some people earning a lot of money, leaving the rest behind. Article 71 is a constant threat to this democracy. We need to review it and make sure that the people who lead us are connected to our common reality. They cannot, by law or any other means, check out of our common reality and erect for themselves a different status within the same country. Then again, we have to amend Article 78, which requires that ministers be taken from parliament. That defeats the whole idea of separation of powers. And I don't know why we will end up doing that. We don't have time. I would have told you the history why and why that is so perverse. What parliament has to do is to hold the executive to check. We cannot say that parliament is holding the executive to check too much. And because of that, we should find a way to make sure that, we get people from parliament in. I agree with my brother Abu Sakara that we need to find a way to force politicians to follow through on what is essentially national agendas. But the question is whether we can agree on what is a national agenda. And I have had a debate about the NDPC and about the long-term plan. And my brother, there will be problems with the NDPC putting out a long-term plan as it is today. If you read Article 56, it specifically prohibits, let me read, it says, Parliament shall have no power to enact a law, to establish or authorize the establishment of a body, that body could be NDPC, with the right or power to impose on the people of Ghana a common program, and that could be the national agenda, or a set of objectives of one, a religious, or two, a political nature. What I'm saying is that if you have that 40-year plan kind of idea, it is a political agenda. And so it will have a problem. Now, I am not against planning, but definitely you cannot have a situation where you have a multi-party democracy where people get elected on their programs and how they articulate it to the people, okay, and have those people get into office and be stuck with following a particular agenda. So I agree that we need to do better planning. This ad hoc 4-year arrangement is hurting us. But we should not pretend that a 40-year development plan or a national development plan or something out of the National Development Planning Commission is essentially the answer. I have had a debate about this with Professor Akosa, and we can go back to the debate. We need to have better planning, but we should not limit it to just a 40-year plan or a long-term development plan from the NDPC. That could create problems for us. Now, with these 4 things, I believe if we can touch them, are the levers, they are the fulcrum, where after dealing with them, you see a number of things find their own level. Now, we need to deal with the whole concept of the winner takes all, or the overwhelming power of the presidency. And that can be done as we move along. You shouldn't be appointing everybody as Sarah. Okay, we can talk about residual issues like whether we need the Council of States, etc., or not. And I think all those things can be discussed. So what we need to do is to find a way to get onto the work of constitutional review and set ourselves some time to achieve those things. And it should not be longer than 5 years. By the time we get into the next presidency and the next presidency is over, these things should be done. It will be to the credit of President Akufo-Addo if he is able to start it and do those ones that he can do, the low-hanging fruit like the election of VCs. He can do those things and kick us off.
Dr. Busakara Fox, I just have 2 quick minutes for your thoughts on something that will lead us into the next show that Raymond is going to lead. And I ask you because you have a young son who I know went to school together at LSE. And I'm going to draw a parallel between your generation and our generation when it comes to the Constitution. Our generation, as exemplified through Fix the Country, through the Economic Fighters League, etc., the view on the Constitution is very different. They want a more radical, what's it called, overthrow of the word? Is it the overhaul of a more radical overhaul of the Constitution. Very radical. In fact, the Freedom Fighters League calls this the Sakawa Constitution, right? And then we have the Fix the Country movement, you know, talking about coup, etc. And then we have your generation. You have a more systematic, evolutionary approach to the Constitution. Now that the president had made this point and said there's time for us to take a second look at it, how do you bridge this gap between your generation and our generation, the 2 extreme views we have on this same document?
Yeah. I think that there are 2 key things. First of all, radicalism is based on the time within which people want to see things happen. It's not based on what they want to see happen. If you go to what they want to see happen, then the same things we're talking about, equality, justice, continuity, etc., are the same things that they're talking about. I mean, there's not a significantly radical way of writing the Constitution that is going to be so different. The framework will be basically the same, but some key areas that we have found problems with would change. And those areas are many. We probably wouldn't be able to do all of them at one sitting. And what we have said basically is that this is a growing tree, you know, and it's going to branch out, but you cannot do away with the stem of the tree. You can have new branches, but you can't just cut the stem out and let the stems exist by themselves. The branches exist by themselves. So we want to see a progressive but comprehensive reform of the Constitution that identifies the key things that we want to see achieved and bequeath to a younger generation. And if we do that in the correct way, I think we'll be not only fulfilling the demands of our generation, but we'll also be lifting the ceiling for a younger generation to not only rise higher than us, but also rise faster than us. So this is my position on the matter. But before I come to that, I want to speak to the issue of my good colleague's position.
Very briefly, because I just have a minute. Very, very briefly.
Yes, okay. But basically, the directive principles of state protocol dictate that you can go to attend to the or use a national development plan if it exists. If it doesn't exist, you go to your manifestos. But to make it exist, so there's no law against using a national development plan. It's just that if it doesn't exist and you go to your manifestos, which are all short-term, then you will have short-termism. And we cannot develop a country on short-termism, especially in a pluralistic democracy, which is becoming more populist and more devoid of the reality because you then make promises you cannot keep. So let's be at least realistic in our approach towards the democracy.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Busakara Fox. Thank you, Kofi Bentil. for your thoughts on this. On the night when the president laid out his thoughts on the Constitution, the amendments he wants to see and the consensus he attempts to build, and on that lifeline he threw for some amendments to the Constitution. We've been live on Joy 99.7 FM. My colleague MFR Powell is taking over with Newsnight right now. Raymond is going to continue with Upfront here on the Joy News channel. And Raymond, just as you take over, your thoughts on that point I made, the last point I made there, very interesting dynamic. The president is saying, living document, be prepared to make necessary amendments. Yes. He's speaking to a generation
that's saying that we are
just
demanding radical changes.
Just after 1992, who want more radical. They don't want to hear this more evolutionary approach.
Isolated changes.
Radical overhaul of it.
And it appears there's no conversation between those two sides on the middle ground or what to do going forward. It's interesting because that particular grouping's views, the views of Face the Country, the views of the fighters, rarely represents the larger grouping on social media who have been very vociferous about radical changes needed. They do not feel that the current constitution meets their needs, the things that they aspire for, and that was written at a time that it can no longer be living for them. It's almost like a different generation's own document. And if we still say that this generation is supposed to be the one with the larger population, driving change, driving the economy of the republic, certainly there will be a difficulty with driving it. It's supposed to be the direction it's supposed to go. So it'll be interesting to know how, when this discussion continues, how the two sides will come to a middle ground. Yeah. Because this is 2022. In the next 2 years, we have a major election on our hands. This certainly will be one of the issues going forward into that election. Anyway.
Absolutely. You need to bridge the gap. How do you do so? It's a very interesting one indeed. Well, that's it for now. We're going to definitely look more to what the president has said tonight. 30 years since we all came together to adopt this constitution. You've heard the thoughts of Kofi Bentil and Dr. Buksakara Foster. Well, more guests are joining us now with your thoughts on what the president had said in this national address on the Upfront. And Raymond Akwa is going to be handling that next.